this video, we're going to introduce the concept of externalities. Now, externalities come in a variety of different types. We have positive externalities and negative externalities, and they can come on either the consumption or the production side. So what do we mean by the concept of an externality? Here I think it helps to use examples and focus on specific types of externalities. So the example we're going to work on in a little bit for a positive externality, the one that the book talks about, is a college education. And so this is a positive externality whereby if you get a college education, you receive some private benefits in the form of higher income, hopefully in the future, right, a better job, and maybe some other private benefits like the fact that you're more aware of current events or can think about them in a different way than you might have without the college education. Negative externalities, right, those are costs that are not being paid for by either the producer or the consumer. And the example we're going to look at here is in the production of electricity. And so in this case, what happens, one of the side effects of producing electricity is pollution. Okay? And so here we're going to look at the market for electricity. And we're going to set up this example such that the externality is on the production side. But it doesn't have to be that way. So here we're looking at an example where generating electricity is creating the pollution, right? So you get sulfur, right? Sulfur dioxide, SO2, as a byproduct of generating electricity through a variety of methods. Alternatively, you could think about when you put gasoline in your car and you go drive your car, right? When you use that gasoline, right, it's not a production side thing, you're using it as a consumer to drive your car, you're generating, right, you're kicking out carbon out of the tailpipe. So there are two different examples of pollution. One is on the production side, the other externality is on the consumption side. I said here we're going to focus on it on the production side. Now, here we're going to first show our market equilibrium. And so I'm going to actually delineate those PM and QM for the market outcome. Now, what we want to note here is that the supply curve here, right, the firms are only taking into account their own private marginal costs, right? Or as the textbook likes to say, marginal private cost. Okay? The firms are not having to pay for the electricity as of yet in our example, and so they're not taking into account the cost of that electricity or the pollution that's generated when they produce electricity. So what we need to do in our analysis is we need to factor in the externality. And in this case, we show that the total cost of generating electricity is higher because we also have, in this case, a pollution. So we have this supply curve S prime, which is reflecting the social marginal cost or marginal social cost. And we see here, right, this height, right, the vertical distance between our supply curves, that's reflecting the value of the externality, right? So we're shifting our supply curve up by the dollar amount of the externality. And notice here, this is the market for electricity, right? So it may be, say, if it's kilowatt hours or whatever the unit of measurement is that we're using. So this here is the externality in terms of the pollution that we're creating per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. Now, if we were to factor in the pollution, right, so we should be, right, the efficient outcome would be not to produce at QM, but where the supply curve that takes into account the negative externality intersects the demand curve. And so that would put us here at QE, and we should be pricing electricity at PE, right? So PE and QE referring to the efficient outcome, the efficient equilibrium. So then what's what's going on here? What are we seeing? Well, we're seeing here that we're producing too much, right? We're actually getting excess production. We should be producing at QE. Instead, we end up producing at QM. Well, why do we refer to that as excess production? Take a look at our demand curve. Remember that the demand curve represents the willingness to pay for that unit of the good, in this case, the electricity. Well, that willingness to pay or marginal benefit for these kilowatt hours of electricity are below the social marginal cost, or the marginal social cost of producing electricity, which is represented up here on this demand curve, on this supply curve. So what are we seeing? We're seeing here a case where the marginal benefit of the electricity, the kilowatt hours between QE and QM, are lower than the marginal cost. Right? So between QE and QM, we have in this range, over here, we see that the marginal benefit is less than the marginal social cost. Right? Remember, the marginal social cost takes into account the firm's marginal cost, the private marginal cost, which reflects directly the cost of production, and the externality. And so if you look at it then over that quantity, we have this triangle in here, which is our dead weight loss. Right? We are overproducing. And so what does that mean here? If you look at this, we're saying, well, that's the area where we're producing where marginal benefit is less than marginal cost. And if you think back to our previous chapter, we defined an efficient outcome in the market as one where the equilibrium quantity is such that marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And so this is a negative externality on the production side. What about a positive externality? So here we can think about a college education. And this is the example that our textbook uses. So again, we want to start off our analysis by just drawing our supply and demand curves and finding our equilibrium that we would get in the free market. Now the externality is a positive externality, and it's on the consumption side. Okay? So when you're deciding whether or not to get your college degree, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about the private returns to yourself. You're probably not thinking about how you're getting a college education might necessarily benefit society on a broader scale. Maybe some of you are, but maybe you're not. So to the extent that you're not taking that into account, then that becomes an externality from your pursuing or consuming a college education. And so how do we look at our supply and demand curves this time? Well, now it's on the demand side. Right? So the supply curve, right, this private supply curve, matches up with the social marginal cost. There's no difference there. However, this demand curve is only representing the marginal private benefit of getting a college education. The true total social marginal benefit or marginal social benefit is actually higher at each level of consumption. And just as we did before, what we're doing is we're shifting our curve up by the amount of the externality. So that vertical distance, right, or the height between our two demand curves, that's reflecting the dollar value of the externality. And so what are we seeing here? Well, we see a couple things. Our new equilibrium is now here. Right? We should be producing QE. Right? So if we think about this as the number of people every year who are getting a college degree, well, too few people are going to college because we're not factoring in the value to the rest of society for when each individual gets a college education. And it should be priced higher, right? So the price is too low, and the quantity is also too low, right? And we're talking about the market compared to the efficient outcome. Right? We should be up here at PE and QE, but the market is down at PM and QM. So what's going on in this case? Well, here, again, think about what we have in terms of the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of these college degrees, right, or these educations between QM and QE. And again, looking at our demand curve, right, the marginal social benefit for the college degrees earned between QM and QE, so if we're looking in at this range here, what's true is that the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal cost of producing those college educations. And yet we're not getting them with the free market because we're not accounting for the externality. So here we see we again have a deadweight loss. And again, you can see, right, the marginal cost of producing these educations is lower than the marginal benefit. So once again, we have a deadweight loss. So this is the basic analysis of how externalities generate what we term a market failure. So what do we mean by market failure? Well, in this case, well, we have two different examples. So with the negative externality, we are producing too much. With the positive externality, we don't produce enough. So we get a market failure when the market on its own does not produce the efficient level of outcome. So the question is, well, how do we fix the problem? How do we move away from the bad equilibrium outcome, which in this case is the market equilibrium, and move towards the efficient outcome? Now we'll turn to that in the next video. Before we get to that, I do want to give a note of caution in that we have to be very careful when we're thinking about these examples. We want to make sure that we understand, well, what is the externality? In the case of an externality like pollution, it's pretty clear that there is a negative externality. Of course, the question is, what is the value of that externality? Okay? And that's something that requires research and analysis to figure that out. And any economist would tell you that in order to get the right efficient equilibrium, we have to know what that value is. Here in these examples, I'm just giving you, oh, here is the value of the externality. The question is, how do we make that assessment? Likewise with a college education, how do we assess that dollar value that we assign to the externality? And it's not an easy thing. And that, in fact, is where economists may end up oftentimes disagreeing, is about the size of externalities, or in some cases, whether they actually exist. Right? Some might debate whether there truly are significant externalities in a college education. Right? So that is one note of caution for you. Now, in the next video, we will turn to our first of two different kinds of solutions that we might have to taking care of the externality problem.